Hello. It has been 1.5 days since the phone call between Trump and Putin, and still we hear no leaks of information. Fine, we can imagine that Putin could have given a very strict order to his subordinates to say nothing. At the same time, the crowd of bloggers and political scientists, of course, has been pushing their nonsense forward. But the officials remain silent. However, it is quite perplexing to hear nothing from the Trump side either. Simultaneously, all other Western leaders that receive this information from Trump are silent too. Remarkably, they all have the same information because they were summoned together and delivered the same message as a group. And, respectively, Trump said that the questions related to Russia and Ukraine should be resolved by the two countries involved, and added that no new sanctions are going to be imposed. He said this in a more evasive way, but this is the meaning. Knowing this, here naturally comes a question. What's going on and why? I have some ideas. Here is my hypothesis. For Trump, the conversation over the phone with Putin ended up being extremely difficult, yet very useful. Here is what I actually mean. Trump, without a doubt, was entering the conversation because he wanted to close the Ukrainian case. Yet he cannot completely close it. And that is what Professor Yevstafiev explains in his posts. But at least Trump would prefer to put it aside in some way. Instead, Trump was shown a different view of the geopolitical situation, and this view was supported by some facts. This updated picture disappointed Trump. I'd like to emphasize that it was not Putin who disappointed Trump, but the objective situation that Putin explained to him. At the same time, Trump realized that his domestic sources of information have been misrepresenting the situation to him. I doubt that the NSA or the CIA do not know the real state of affairs. Of course they do. However, I personally know cases when, in the United States, correct information obtained by the lower levels of those agencies failed to reach the upper levels. By the way, the 9/11 case is one of the most known examples of this. I do know more recent examples as well, but I'm sorry, I do not think today is a good moment to share this. Anyway, this is the main issue. So, in other words, Trump understood that he had acted based on a distorted view of the situation. I'm not trying to say his overall knowledge about the world was totally wrong, but his understanding of the regional specifics was not quite in line with reality. And then he received this new information from Putin. Trump, of course, did not just accept Putin's viewpoint, but he updated his own mental picture based on these new facts. This is the principal moment, because next, all those leaders of Western Europe had the meeting with Trump, and they faced the objective fact that Trump's vision of the situation had changed. They do not know what to do, because it is already absolutely clear that America is not giving the money. Specifically, is not giving the money to them. I would like to point out that Trump's prediction that Powell would become more compliant turned out to be true, at least in part, during the last week. I said this already, and I would repeat it again. As shown by our macroeconomic review from last Saturday, regarding the inflation markers, the markers were up. Powell, of course, knew about them before making his most recent decision about the interest rate. So, based on the markers, generally, Powell would have to raise the interest rate, but he ended up not raising it. Someone would say, sure, but he didn't lower it either. That is correct, because doing so would mean his capitulation to Trump. I strongly suspect that Trump and Powell have already reached some agreement. I don't know exactly how, either directly or indirectly, via intermediaries, because after all, those people that make strategic decisions, including those that stand behind Trump, we do not always know them. They might have agreed that none of this matters anymore, since we're already going into the crisis. Certainly, the interest rate can be raised sharply, and then the collapse will happen immediately, or the rate can be lowered, causing inflation to soar. By the way, the Federal Reserve just recently printed something, meaning issued some money. I would like to point out that money issuance equals lowering the interest rate, as it was proved by mathematical modeling a while ago. From the standpoint of how this affects the economy, the effects are the same. For this reason, I cannot rule out a possibility that Trump is gradually taking control over the Federal Reserve. Let's not forget that the leaders of the Federal Reserve are U.S. citizens, and they live in the United States. Without a doubt, they're connected with the Euro-Atlantic elites, but then shown concrete arguments, also supported by various punitive actions. Well, I'm encouraging you to look at what happened recently, even though it happened even before the Trump-Putin call. The attempt started to put serious pressure on some people from the old political camp, the top officials. Very serious pressure. For instance, the former FBI director is being investigated. So all of this means that Trump understands the need for the get tough approach. Also, I think his conversation with Putin only reinforced this understanding. This can be seen by the fact that other political actors in Europe started to behave more cautiously. There is no doubt that Zelenskyy will continue acting obnoxiously, because he is tasked to keep the war going at any cost. One of the most significant recent achievements of Putin, the political achievement over the last weeks or months, is that he proved that Zelenskyy is the main instigator of the war, and he is willing to do anything in his capacity for the war to continue. We all understand why this is, as the Chaos Party, led by London, has been discussed many, many times. Burns is gone, but his project is alive and well. Remarkably, the stability of the global financial system continues to decline. It is seen, for example, by the recently failed auction for Japanese government bonds. I do not remember the informal name of those in Japan. The US ones are called the treasuries. Anyway, despite the high yields, the prices went down because demand for bonds was dropping. In other words, the collapse is nearing. There are two options here. Either the Japanese central bank prints more money, causing high inflation. Imagine this happening in Japan, where deflation has taken place for decades. Or, alternatively, declares a default, as Japan won't be able to service its high national debt. Neither is a good option. But as we talked before, from Trump's perspective, such a crisis is a useful tool. I can now rule out the possibility that the events of this sort, such as the crisis in Japan, can become a trigger for the global financial collapse. In summary, this is the picture of the world we live in today. Nothing can be done about this. All of this is due to the objective economic circumstances. I think that Trump, based on the new information he gathered from Putin, may start acting differently. Soon, his new outlook will somehow manifest itself. For us, it would make sense to go back to this discussion no earlier than on Monday or Tuesday. Once again, the fact that we have not heard any media leaks confirms that the conversation was extremely important for the both sides involved, especially for Trump, because he is a person prone to certain self-euphoria. He draws a pretty picture of the world for himself and then starts to live in it. People who work with Trump do not always succeed in bringing him back down to our sinful earth, but it seems like Putin was able to do so. For that reason, I expect Trump to make several sober steps soon enough, which would be interesting for us to see. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.